Well, welcome everyone to this program on a timely subject, which is that of disinformation. It is organized by the delegations of the United States and Estonia and co-sponsored by the delegation of the European Union.
Good evening to everybody, and on behalf of Estonia, we are really pleased to co-sponsor today's event that addresses a global issue that doesn't recognize any borders. And disinformation is really a challenge we have to tackle collectively.
Thank you, Ambassador, and Excellencies, dear participants. In the European Union, and in particular within the European External Action Service, we have accumulated a lot of relevant knowledge on the phenomenon. Based on this knowledge, we are happy to share our experience and our model of response with you in this side event today.
It falls to me now to bring this discussion down to the level of what we're doing here in the OPCW. And unfortunately, at the OPCW, we have to deal with disinformation on a regular basis. They're often literally life and death issues, whether it's the poisoning in Salisbury, the poisoning of Mr. Navalny, the use of chemical weapons in Syria, or the excellent work of the Technical Secretariat. So we need to be able to deal with this disinformation.
My name is John Spikerman. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm one of the senior officials at the Global Engagement Center at the U.S. Department of State. The instances where we have seen the use of chemical weapons or a threat to use chemical weapons are by their nature confusing and chaotic moments in time where facts are not always clear and narratives that develop at the outset of a crisis are not always supported later when the facts eventually do emerge. Disinformation actors are well aware of this, and they use this to their advantage. So with that, we will begin our discussion, first with Davy Alba. Davy is a technology reporter for the New York Times and covers online disinformation and its global harm. Davy, I'll turn it over to you.
So to be very clear, state-sponsored disinformation is global in scope. And I'd encourage you all to read the annual media manipulation survey from the Oxford Internet Institute. In each of the 81 countries that the Oxford research team surveyed, they found social media manipulation of public opinion and deemed it a growing threat to democracies around the world. They say private strategic communications firms are playing an increasing role in spreading computational propaganda, with researchers identifying state actors working with such firms in 48 countries. Almost $60 million has been spent on firms who use bots and other amplification strategies to create the impression of trending political messaging. On the ground level, though, it's really difficult to distinguish what state-sponsored disinformation is and what is self-promoting misinformation. Much of it takes the posts of the form of viral posts on online platforms, on Facebook groups, in tweets, on YouTube videos, blasted out through Telegram channels, and more. But more or less, one surefire way to tell when a country is experiencing state-sponsored disinformation, I should say, is to pay attention to what the local civil rights and research groups are pointing to on the ground, and what they're saying others should be paying attention to. But this truly is a global problem, and it is worth increasing all of our media literacy together to be able to identify these things when they're happening and think about solutions.
Our next speaker is Pasi Aronen, who is an international security expert at EU versus Disinfo, which is the flagship project of the European External Action Service's East Stratcom Task Force, established in 2015 to better forecast, address, and respond to disinformation campaigns affecting the European Union, its member states, and countries in the shared neighborhood.
Our work on is, of course, disinformation in EU's Eastern Partnership countries, And of course, like the key threat actor, if I may use that kind of a term here, is of course like disinformation emanating from Russia or from pro-Kremlin outlets. At our division and in our task forces, we see disinformation as being one of the tools in this wider toolkit that the threat actors are applying. And often disinformation does not kind of like appear alone, but it's often used in combination with other kinds of tools. For example, let's say cyber attack, which steals information and then it's used in disinformation campaigns. So it's a combination, it's a kind of like part of the larger toolkit in coercing or like interfering into the dealings of other nations. It's important for us to build up the member state capacities and also those, for example, Eastern Partnership nations capacities, so that they themselves can also do the countering work. They know what is disinformation, what kind of patterns it follows, what kind of structures support it, how to protect the citizenry from this virus of the mind. And for that reason, for example, media literacy and improving that. And of course, all of these action, they need to be somehow packaged into lessons learned, into policy work, into strategic work in an EU level, in order for us, for example, to enact legislation which may, for example, help commercial companies such as social media giants to be better able to address this problem, which is happening on their platforms and which is targeting the EU citizens' minds. And of course, like sanctioning based on evidence, based on our understanding of the hostile actions themselves. And of course, we have to understand that all of this happens in some context. There's a geopolitical rivalry. There is, of course, like certain aims, strategic aims that our adversaries are aiming at, which these disinformation activities are supporting.
Elliot's a Citizen journalist and founder of Bellingcat, which is an open source investigation website I'm sure many of you have heard of. He has investigated the Syrian civil war, the 2014 Russian military intervention in Ukraine, the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, and the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Elliot, I'll turn it over to you.
So I'm going to talk today about how throughout the years of studying the conflict in Syria and MH17, the Navalny poisoning and the Skripal poisoning and all the other poisonings we've looked into, how Russian disinformation has used a rather unusual source for its various claims that it makes. Time and time again, conspiracy theories, fringe bloggers, NGOs with connections to the Syrian regime who produced dodgy reports, they were being cited by the Russian Federation. And over time, what the Russian Federation changed, but it was always very much following what the kind of latest theory on the internet was. Russia would rely on online conspiracy theories, fringe websites, and odd NGOs for basically all their messaging around these topics. And this continues, even with the recent Navalny poisoning and the Skripal poisoning and everything else that's going on. What you find often with these communities is they're quite tight-knit. They make a huge amount of noise, but what they're actually often doing is basically amplifying each other's claims and stories and personalities and figures. So it creates this echo chamber effect, and it very rarely has a major impact outside of that echo chamber. But these are the kind of groups and individuals that the Russian state and the Russian media amplifies when it's trying to come up with its messaging. I think one of the most significant cases, though, has been the 2018 Duma chemical attack. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the kind of artificial scandal that has been generated by various organizations, most particularly the Working Group on Syria Propaganda and the Media, who has acquired various leaked documents from former OPCW staff members, which were then selectively leaked with the help of WikiLeaks. It's through the internet that these people are able to find each other. It's allowed the people who would normally be on street corners shouting conspiracy theories to find like-minded people and come together and form these communities and these groups. And they have their websites, their blogs, their video blogs, their Twitter accounts, and they create these kind of counterfactual ecosystems. And this is what the Russian government is very active in trying to use for its own purposes. And we've seen this with chemical weapons attacks in Syria.
let's move on to Q&A period here for the full group. It has become increasingly clear that major social media platforms, and Facebook in particular, promote dis and misinformation, not because of any flaw or failure of content moderation, but as a feature of algorithms that drive traffic. It is their fundamental revenue model. Is there a regulatory solution? I'll go first to Davey on that one.
Giving over the responsibility of regulation to governments. And, it depends on which government is sort of in charge of that, right? We should be aware that it is absolutely, as the questioner mentioned, a product of the algorithmic structure of these companies that, our other panelists mentioned. These communities form around shared interests and often are in their own echo chambers, but it is through the use of algorithms that these echo chambers can kind of be pierced and often spill out into the mainstream. There has to be a way to address that, but we have to make sure that all the people involved, all the actors, the governments, people who want to express themselves or expose local abuses are not tamped down by any regulatory framework.
Thanks, Davey. Let me turn it to Pasi. Pasi, you mentioned legislation in your remarks.
I think that there lies opportunities for regulation, because now, of course, this kind of like emotional speech and like evoking emotions on those platforms, it means more traction, more people, more eyeballs, and at the same time also consumption of ads, etc., like the monetization cycle there. So somehow there should be also financial incentive to somehow like make sure that we like this kind of like monetization cycle will not actually lead into ripping our societies apart and supporting the polarization of our societies. And I think that there's lots of ground to be covered there in cooperating with the platforms, and we need to make sure that we don't lose that cooperation with, for example, with some too heavy-handed regulatory approaches.
Thanks, Pasi, and I agree. We've seen a lot of successes from our cooperation with some of the social media giants. What about other social media platforms that might be more closed networks, like a Telegram, or smaller outfits that might either be based outside of the U.S. Or another Western country, or perhaps based in a Western country but focused on a fringe audience? How would you approach countering disinformation on those types of platforms?
I think that's actually where it becomes the most difficult, because when you're dealing with closed social networks, they can actually be a much bigger kind of vector for disinformation, because if you're part of those social networks, then often you're much more trusting of the information that is being shared there. And for me, the solution is more about educating people from an earlier age in particular about the internet, and not just saying here's a bunch of disinformation and here's how you counter it, or here's how you know it's disinformation. And that is useful, but that can't be the be all and end all of it.
Great, thanks, Elliot. And your answer was kind of getting to this next set of questions that we have that all kind of roughly fall into this category of how do you effectively counter disinformation. Let me put this first one to Pasi. What are the signs that a piece of information is likely to be part of a disinformation campaign? And what are the rhetorical tricks to sow doubts about truthful information?
I would like to refer something to what Elliot was already mentioning earlier, the role of the civil society organizations of various sorts. And I think that since, let's say, 2014, like the role of these organizations has grown tremendously in this space of fighting, countering the disinformation. Like through these active individuals, through these active communities, we need to have lots of contributing people, like who know all these target countries, all these countries where our adversaries are operating, like they are kind of like living and breathing that cultural information. Otherwise, you're unable, like from Brussels, from the ivory towers and of IEEAS, it's clear that we alone, we couldn't identify all the harmful narratives that are going around. In the end, like this information ecosystem is a network of actors, and there's like resources, information flowing, different kinds of like platforms utilized, etc. And in order to combat that kind of structure, we need to also have our own network in place. It can't be like a singular institution.
From the GEC's perspective, we also kind of take the step to identify what we call TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures of disinformation actors. I wonder, maybe Elliot, I'm sure you've looked into this in the past. If we're thinking about TTPs.
I think the one thing to understand with Russia is when you're dealing with disinformation, in a way, don't overthink it, because Russia will just use anything it can to throw at you to distract from what you're saying. And I've heard this both in a kind of online context, but also, people at the UN have spoken to me where they'll go in a meeting with the Russians on a topic, and the Russians will come in with a big folder and say, this is our evidence that, the white helmets are liars. And it'll be a bunch of printouts on the internet. But because they're Russia and it's the Russian Federation presenting it officially at the UN, they have to take the stuff seriously. And because there's so much of it, they just get overwhelmed with nonsense, effectively. My kind of preferred approach is almost to create kind of, against the virus of disinformation, create kind of white blood cells to, react against it. When you've got an actor that is willing to lie about anything, and believe me, Russia will lie at the drop of a hat. Anything they say, fact check it. In fact, I recommend people who are learning how to do open source investigation fact check Russian press conferences, especially from the Ministry of Defense, because you will find an endless torrent of lies if you actually bother fact checking them. For those actors who aren't engaged with it, they need to be able to recognize people who are kind of trustworthy individuals and organizations who know what they're talking about, but also those organizations need to provide almost the ammunition and the weaponry for that, in that it could be fact checks, which are very useful, but also detailed evidence behind those fact checks. With the OPCW, it could be more things like pages on the website that explain certain techniques that are used for investigations and in the reporting, like, for example, how the chlorine samples were taken in the Duma attack. That is something that could bear with a lot more explanation, because I think a lot of people who dismiss those think someone put a kind of wet wipe on it and put it in a plastic bag, when it's more than that. But unless we have that kind of information, how can you expect people who are on the front lines, who just ordinary people just trying to find out the truth, to be able to respond to that kind of disinformation? So I think it comes down to recognizing that these communities exist and thinking, how do we kind of equip them, rather than large organizations like the OPCW engaging with these bad actors directly, because then that just elevates those bad actors rather than really countering the disinformation.
A couple points jumping off of what my fellow panelists have said here on disinformation. The lies are very repetitive. So, that is one of the challenges of covering misinformation is, you sort of think, oh, we've already debunked this. When do we address it again? You have to be cognizant that you're covering it, even if it's debunking it, can raise the profile of that lie. And so that's something that we always have to think about and make judgments on. And the other thing that I just wanted to say, it is a service to us all to educate ourselves on the various quirks of these platforms, to understand what tactics these misinformation actors use to spread the lies. So, for instance, on Twitter, they repeatedly use the same phrasings to make a certain hashtag trend. Similarly, on Facebook, you'll see a bunch of different tactics used, just being auto-added to Facebook groups, giant groups around certain topics, and particularly inflammatory posts that go viral. I think, a part of the education that we're all talking about here is also an education in the platform dynamics and how certain posts spread through these various platforms.
Thanks, Davey. We've got a related question. I'll pose this to Pasi first. The questioner says, evidence in the CVE, countering violent extremism space, has demonstrated that counter messaging is at best ineffective and possibly serves to entrench existing beliefs. Have there been similar efforts to understand the impacts of fact-checking or counter messaging in the state-sponsored disinformation space?
So it's not only we are not what we do, for example, at EEAS, it's not about counter propaganda, because we are not in information warfare ourselves. We are just exposing the lies and and then setting it in the right context and giving the truth. And so what we do is a service to our citizens and to these important kind of gatekeepers, such as journalists, who may use that information with their own sophistication. Back in the days, there was like one viewpoint, another viewpoint, and truth was somewhere there in the middle. At the moment, especially when you are fighting against like state actors, it's not like that. There's a truth on the one side, and then there's blatant lie. So I think that I would still argue that it's important for us to understand and expose those falseful narratives, because it also gives us information about the potential strategic goals of our adversaries. What are they aiming at? Why they are, for example, reauthoring certain part of history? Is it telling us something about their own vulnerabilities, their own insecurities? Although I must say that debunking alone, it's a whack-a-mole game. There needs to be these other tools, which is about like empowering the social, like civil society organizations, educating the citizenry, etc., and building these capacities and supporting free media.
Are there any specific examples of a successful effort that effectively countered disinformation that you're particularly proud of?
I think MH17 for us has certainly been something that's successful, because I think without that, the narrative would have been very much directed by the Russian Federation, and we would have been further away from the truth.
From our perspective, our fight against fallacies regarding COVID-19 and, for example, vaccines.
Early in the pandemic, there was a viral video by Judy Mikovits called Plandemic. It went absolutely viral. And then there was a Plandemic 2 that was going to be released. We knew when that documentary was going to drop, and we all sort of kept eyes on it, and we were able to, quickly try to educate everyone that this was not something that should go viral again, using what happened before to learn from our mistakes and make sure that we're all, again, raising our media literacy together.
Great, thank you. All excellent examples. And I'll put in my own plug for my own team's work. The GEC released last year a special report called The Pillars of Russia's Disinformation and Propaganda Ecosystem. And since the release of that report, the social media presence of a lot of those proxy websites has been severely restricted or diminished. So that's an accomplishment for the entire counter-disinformation community there. I'd really like to thank the panelists, and especially thank you to the organizers of this event, the embassies of Estonia, the United States, and the European Union.